Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Thursday, the 7th. And I'm sorry that I wasn't feeling well last week. I had posted an old video that I had made about The Exorcist. And The Exorcist is a tricky film just because it's so graphic. It's one of the reasons why I've got the disclaimer on the syllabus. And I've mentioned Stephen King before in terms of Dance Macabre, that text that he wrote, in which he talked a little bit about horror film and his perspective on the Gothic tradition. And he talks a little bit about different levels of fear. And one of the ones that he mentions, the lowest level, is the gross out. And I think The Exorcist is a great example of that, where basically you're trying to shock the audience. And I've always thought that that film has been misunderstood, much like the text upon which it was based, which was a New York Times bestseller, has also been misunderstood. That the focus is on the possessed girl from most audience members, and rightly so when we either see or read those graphic descriptions. But the title is very clear that it's about the exorcist. And once we put our focus on Damien Karras and we put our focus on Lancaster Marin and their inner demons, as well as the demons of the surrounding characters, um, in terms of the film, there was a piece that was left out because basically Blatty worked very carefully with with Friedkin, both of them, the director and author, to put together the film, and the film is very similar to the novel. But there was a piece in the novel that was not included in the original film, but was included in what's known as the version you've never seen before. It's the director's cut. I wish they wouldn't refer to it as the version you've never seen before, because obviously you've seen that version if you are discussing that. And but nevertheless, there was a scene about how ultimately the purpose of possession is not to torment the individual who's possessed, but those who are surrounding the possessed individual. And I think that that very much illustrates the idea of the title of The Exorcist, that the focus should not be on Regan McNeil. Um, they ended up adding that scene that they had deleted in the original, which was a rather long film. They ended up adding it into that version you've never seen before, just to clarify for audiences. But I think very much about the 1970s and some of the revolutionary movements that were going on in the 1960s, and about now thinking about child as enemy, as in effect a kind of monstrosity. And I think we saw that with Night of the Living Dead, where we've got the young daughter who basically um, kills her father and her mother, or actually she kills her mother is what she does. She stabs her in a way that's reminiscent of Psycho, in effect. And then ultimately what we get is this focus on youth in film that I don't think we've necessarily seen thus far. And certainly that's related to something like Halloween. So, going to Halloween, which is our film for this week, um, it is probably one of the most successful independent films made. Certainly up until this point. We'll talk about this again when we talk about the Blair Witch Project. It was released independently and regionally first, Kansas City of all places, on a $320,000 budget. Which, even for the time period in which the film came out in 1978, was a minuscule amount of money. Um, at least in terms of filming for Hollywood. It earned over $55 million in sales, one of the highest grossing independent films of all time. So there's something about this film that has captured the imagination. And we talked about that there was something about The Exorcist that captured the imagination. I had given you the advice that you might want to stop watching The Exorcist after the first half hour because it gets quite graphic. And if you didn't feel comfortable with watching those graphic episodes, you didn't necessarily need to do so. But I did give you some documentaries to view about how audiences responded. And I can tell you that the audience response was was pretty darn visceral to The Exorcist. People were hysterical. People needed to be hospitalized. Reportedly, one man attacked the screen with a knife because he wanted to kill the demon. I think about the time period, one in which drug use was embraced, and I suspect that many audience members might have been under the influence when they were watching that film. That and the idea that no one had ever seen anything like that before. So The Exorcist really paved the way for a lot of the gore that we come to sometimes associate with horror film. But as we've talked about in the context of this class, that horror film is more than just jump scare and gore, and that if you choose the right film, it's very much a reflection of the anxiety of our times. So Halloween is another film that I kind of basically cheated with. As you know, for the 1960s, I had assigned two films, even though normally I've been assigning one film for each decade. I assigned Psycho just because it's such a masterpiece. And oftentimes we think of Hitchcock as the modern master of horror, and certainly of suspense. And then Night of the Living Dead, towards the ending of the decade, which is very much a film about revolution and unrest. And also, it just revolutionized the idea of what a zombie could be. As I talked about, it was no longer based on Haitian folklore, but basically, Romero invented, if you will, what we think of as the contemporary zombie, which works so well as a metaphor in so many ways. Um, One of Romero's perhaps most famous works is Dawn of the Dead, which is a sequel to Night of the Living Dead, and it is set in a shopping mall. And this is in the 1970s when shopping malls were beginning to become quite popular, and that the possibilities for symbolism that the shoppers in previous lives have become zombies because basically they acted like zombies when they were alive. So once bitten by a zombie, they would re-inhabit malls and go to places that were familiar, and that zombies, or I should say that shoppers are mindless consumers, much like zombies are mindless monstrosities. So that was a great commentary at the time. And I think we can also see how Halloween could be a commentary of its time period. That even though it is from 1979, I think of it as really ushering in the 1980s. The 80s were very well known for slasher films, which began really with Halloween. And if you know anything about the 1980s, that was the time of President Reagan's administration and Reaganomics. It was a very conservative time period, and I think Halloween is so interesting on two levels. The first, we could see it as a reinforcement of conservative values. And in fact, that's part of the readings that I had suggested, more than suggested, I had assigned for Halloween, is that what we get is Michael, who is in effect a kind of serial killer, who's enacting a very conservative form of justice by targeting youth who are engaged in questionable activities, certainly in terms of the Ronald Reagan conservative era, whether it be smoking marijuana or being sexually promiscuous. It's led to the old trope now that the sexually promiscuous teenagers are the ones that are killed in horror film first, and it's the virginal girl at the end who survives. It also can be seen in another way as a way of sort of questioning the conservatism of the time period, because we're supposed to bond with these teenagers, and of course they might have been engaging in some behavior that could be seen as socially unacceptable, but they certainly didn't deserve to be killed, and killed in such gruesome ways. So I think it very much is an influence, or I think this film is very much influenced by the idea of the conservatism that was coming in response to a lot of the radical 1960s and early 1970s. And John Carpenter is the director for Halloween. He was a USC grad, and that makes him unusual in and of itself, in that he had education and he had studied film, so he utilized many of those techniques. And he was very much influenced by the film Psycho. And you know that Psycho is very much about voyeurism and about looking and gazing. And definitely we get that sense in Halloween as well, except we look and gaze through the mind or the eyes of the killer, Michael Myers. That said, you might recognize some names. Dr. Sam Loomis, I'm sorry, which was also a name that you would have found in Psycho, which is also going to be the name of one of our characters in Halloween. And what's an interesting piece of trivia that I might have mentioned earlier, that in Psycho, the Marion Crane character is played by Janet Leigh, very famous actress at the time. Her daughter, Jamie Lee Curtis, and Jamie Lee Curtis played the lead role of Laurie in Halloween, so that's yet another connection. We also know that Psycho is very famous because of its iconic soundtrack, and John Carpenter created the soundtrack for Halloween, which has become almost as iconic. Um, and it's a brilliant idea, actually, because up until that point, no one had really set a horror film on Halloween, and Halloween is so symbolic. Certainly, in terms of the pagan calendar, we've just celebrated Halloween. What ended up happening from a commercial perspective is that people tend to watch Halloween on Halloween, which is one of the reasons perhaps that this film is so popular and so enduring. But Halloween, from the pagan lore perspective, is when the veil is thinnest between the living and the dead. So there's all kinds of supernatural possibilities. And Michael, who is our killer, in some ways seems to have supernatural abilities, and that he can't be killed, which can also be viewed metaphorically, symbolically, that you just can't kill evil, for instance. And um, that said, I think that what we see is, again, a critique of suburbia. We've got several films that have done this, that suburbia is not a safe place at all. We see what seems to be an idealistic neighborhood of Michael's victims. You know, initially, he was raised there, which again leads to the question of what is the monstrosity behind closed doors? That suburbia seems to be perfection, but behind closed doors, it's a very different reality. And of course, he targets his victims in his same neighborhood years later, so that ultimately that neighborhood is anything but safe. And Michael's always wearing a mask. A little bit of trivia here. That mask was actually a William Shatner mask, William Shatner being an actor who played Captain Kirk of Star Trek fame. And they just basically made a few alterations to it. And that mask, again, it works so nicely symbolic, from a symbolic perspective. You know, what is behind the mask that we all wear? And this film utilizes something called Panaglide, which we might know as a Steadicam. So the filming techniques were unusual, getting the murderer's view was unusual, the score became iconic, and it helped to develop what's known as the final girl. You might be familiar with this term because it's become part of our lexicon. And this is a strong female character in horror film who is able to defeat or at least stand up to evil. That said, she suffers through great hardship and torture. And the final girl, oftentimes has been seen, you know, as this is commentary on feminism, both from a positive perspective, the strong female who tries to defeat evil and may indeed be successful, but also as a negative in the sense that she's tortured and maligned throughout the entire film. Um, I think the film also is a commentary on something else from the 1980s, and this is about absent parents. The 1980s and late 70s were the beginning of the time where you really had a majority of the two-parent household, of both parents basically working to support a family, which meant that there were oftentimes absentee children at home. In fact, there was a term for them. They were known as latchkey kids because they would be given a key that they would use to enter into the home after school and await their parents. And notice how few adults we see in the film Halloween. And the idea is that this is what happens when you've got absent parents, is that you've got, teenagers who are smoking and having sex and might even be vulnerable to outside forces of evil, so much so that they could even be killed. We definitely see this idea of the inhumanity of murderers. We don't really get a reason for why Michael does what he does. I don't know if that's necessarily any consolation if we can explain away evil. We know that the film begins when basically his parents are out and his sister is supposed to be babysitting him, but she's not. She's engaged in sexual activity with her boyfriend, so he's feeling neglected. And then ultimately he responds by donning a clown mask and stabbing. And that stabbing has oftentimes been likened to a phallic symbol. This is something that we talked about with Psycho as well when we were talking about Norman Bates. Um, and some have even suggested that when Laurie turns the tables and that she begins to stab Michael with things like coat hangers, that this is just an image of sexual repression, because Laurie is the virginal one in the group. I don't know necessarily if I would agree to that piece. It seems like it's a bit of a stretch, but certainly the idea that Michael is angry about the fact that his sister is neglectful and is angry about the fact that his parents are neglectful, I think that's very much indicative of the 1980s and children who are left without parental supervision and the sorts of challenges and difficulties that they might get involved with. But in terms of talking about supernatural possibilities, because this film is set in Halloween when the veil is thinnest between the living and the dead, Michael can't seem to be killed. I don't know whether that's a metaphor that you can never kill evil, or whether or not it is the supernatural element that's associated with Halloween. Notice the beginning of the film really focuses in on that pumpkin. The pumpkin has all kinds of relevance during Halloween. We put a light inside of a pumpkin during Halloween to ward off evil spirits, and obviously that's not successful in warding off Michael's evil. You may or may not know that Halloween is a mixture of a lot of different cultural traditions, and one of them is from the Irish, where they had a story about Jack, a boy named Jack, who's rather mischievous and well, pretty much, it's on the edge of evil. So when he turned into an old man and died, ultimately the devil didn't want Jack because he wasn't quite evil enough, but God didn't want Jack either because Jack wasn't good enough. So Jack had no home in the afterlife, in the netherworld. He was left to wander aimlessly in the dark. But God and the devil felt sorry for Jack, and they provided him with a lantern, a light. And that's Jack's Lantern, or Jack-o'-lantern. And the Irish used to celebrate this by basically putting a light inside these large gourds. And that said, when they came to the United States during the Great Potato Famine, they tried to celebrate their cultural traditions and found that, the gourds that we had were rather small, but we had something called a pumpkin that would suffice very nicely. So that's what they used. So you can see that the jack-o'-lantern or the pumpkin is a mixture of a lot of different cultural traditions. But I think it's quite symbolic, the idea that Michael represents the dark and darkness, and that the pumpkin is trying to shed light, but it's not strong enough to be able to do so. Um, and that said, in this case, the paperback, a mass market paperback, in other words, the written text came out after the film, not before the film, as we've seen with so many of these Hollywood films where they are based on a text. Actually, it was the film that came out first, the screenplay, and it was so successful that a book was written based on the screenplay. So, in terms of thinking about some themes, we will see the theme of the continued collapse of the nuclear family. And this is something that we've begun to see, starting with Invasion of the Body Snatchers in Suburbia, and that worked its way through with Psycho and, the idea of illicit affairs and also a very isolated family unit. And then also that would work its way through to something like Night of the Living Dead, where you've got children who are basically killing parents. Certainly, we see that with something like The Exorcist, where we've got a Chris McNeil as a single mother. So that's in theory, one of the quote reasons unquote as to why Reagan is targeted. In that she comes from a broken home and she has access to supernatural tools such as Ouija boards, and she lives near a church, and there's an agnostic sense in the family. So all of that is I think illustrated in something like Halloween, where again we've got seemingly absentee parents and children that could be viewed to be running amok, and the consequences of that. Um, so, in terms of thinking about the class as a whole, as we're getting closer and closer to contemporary time periods, I so hope that you've been putting in some serious thought into your final project. And thank you for those of you who've reached out to me in your final projects. You can see that I've fallen a little bit behind with grading discussion forum questions, but I plan on catching up next week. And in terms of the final project, this is where you have a lot of latitude and trying to determine what you are going to examine in depth. So there are three components to this class. The first is the attendance question, where I direct you to briefly discuss something about the film. The second is the journal, which is due at the same time as the discussion forum question, where I don't direct you and that you are submitting into me thoughts and reflections about the film that are independent and different from what you would have written in your discussion forum. Then there is ultimately, actually, there's 4 components to the class. I might have said 3 components. Then there is the final project, which is due at the ending of the semester, but you can hand it in at any point. So it could be that you are thinking about devoting your final project to one of the films we've already seen. And it would make sense that you could begin and even submit in that final project at this point, because we've talked about that film. You might still be waiting for some upcoming films. So you might want to wait a little bit, which is why the final project isn't due until the ending of the semester. Or you might want to do something that's a little bit more creative. Perhaps you might want to talk about a film that we didn't see in class. Perhaps you want to do something like create your own short, a horror film, for instance. I've mentioned several times about students doing things like creating models and giving class presentations and so forth. One you can even find in the GCC library. So I'm hopeful that at this point you're beginning to think seriously about the final project. Next class, I'm going to talk specifically about quotation and how you would quote from a film and also how you would quote from a text. So depending on the a sort of assignment that you want to do, you may or may not need to quote, but I wanted to make sure that over the next several classes we start talking about the final project. And then, as you know, there's a final examination, and it's open book, open notes, and it's based on basically all of the readings and all of the films we've done over the course of the semester. And certainly the best way to prepare for that, in addition to watching all the films and doing all the readings, is doing all the discussion forum responses and reading your peers' responses and my responses in turn. That's supposed to duplicate what we would have done during a class discussion. And when you put all of that together, what you should get is a good holistic overview of the class. Again, reviewing your journals too might be a nice way of doing that, especially because it's an open book, open note exam. And usually when I teach this class in a face-to-face situation, that would be, well, actually not usually, always when I teach this class in a face-to-face situation, that would be an in-class final examination. And that would occur over a 2 to 3 hour period, because it's a once weekly meeting class, usually in the evenings. That's what I'm offering in the spring semester for face to face for this version of the class. But we're taking the online version, as you know. So, what I will be doing is posting the final during our last class, and then ultimately giving you 24 hours rather than just 2 or 3 to respond to that. And basically, I don't expect anything as well written or as developed as something you might do in a final project, for instance, because you wouldn't have the leisure of all of the time to be able to put it all together. But basically, I'll ask you some essay questions and ask you to choose and talk a little bit about how you could synthesize all of the elements of the class. And while certainly you're not held to the same standard of writing and content, you should still have a beginning, a middle, and end, which is pretty typical of an essay, and be able to address some of the themes that we've talked about over the course of the semester. So, in terms of thinking about our discussion forum question for this particular film, this will be due Saturday on the 9th. And again, if you need an extension, just ask me. I'll be happy to grant it to you. And why do you think, after viewing Halloween, why do you think it was such a successful movie? As I had said, it was at the time the most successful or the highest grossing independent film of the time. So why do you think this film was so particularly successful from a economic perspective? And as you know, I like to ask questions that don't have right or wrong answers, that really require you to think and to reason. Again, you're not required to respond to your peers, but certainly you can if you're moved to. But you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. And next week, we get to talk about the 1990s. Now that I'm using this film, albeit it was from the late 70s, to represent the 1980s. The film that I'm using to represent the 1990s is The Blair Witch Project. And the 1990s was the birth of the internet and the technological revolution that we are experiencing today. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to focus on the Blair Witch Project, which is so concerned with the idea of documentation from a technological perspective. So I was able to find a link for free online for that. You can see that in the third section in the notes below. As you know, it becomes increasingly challenging for me to find links for free. So we may get to the point in the semester where you might need to rent a movie or purchase a movie or stream a movie. And all of these movies are on DVD on reserve in the GCC library if you so wanted to access them. But the reality is that at least as of today, this is a working link for the Blair Witch Project. So that will get us to the 1990s. So with that said, I'm going to leave you so that you can watch either Halloween, but I always give you the film 1 week in advance, especially because last week was Halloween, so you might have wanted to have seen Halloween during Halloween. Or perhaps you might want to watch this week The Blair Witch Project, but our attendance question is not on The Blair Witch Project this week because that is the film that we'll talk about next week. Our attendance question is on Halloween. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and I'm curious to see why you think Halloween was just such a successful independent film. Take care. Bye bye.